Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Auke Eispit, and it's a great pleasure to be the moderator for this colloquium on robotics and neuroscience. This is organized by the International Foundation of Robotics Research. So we are lucky today to have I think we'll have a very interesting discussion on how robotics and neuroscience can interact. And to start a bit the discussions, we'll have 10 very short talks. The first one by Alain Berthoz, who will present a bit his work on movement control and principles of movement control and how it relates to spatial navigation. Then a talk by Yasuo Koniyoshi about embodiment and development. A third presentation by Scott Dell, more about musculoskeletal simulation and how they can be helped for treatments. And I'll give a short presentation about robotics for investigating the principles of spinal cord circuits for locomotion. On top of that, we are lucky to have 5 front row participants who are really experts in the field and who will be part of the discussion. And so you should see them here, and they'll also bring their own comments and questions to the whole discussion. So you see here Brenna Argel. She is from Northwestern University, and she has expertise in rehabilitation robotics and machine learning. Cecilia Latchkin from SSSA, who is an expert in neurorobotics and soft robotics. Laura Marshall Crespo, who is an expert in motor learning and neurorehabilitation. Yoshi Nakamura from University of Tokyo, who is an expert in robotics, humanoid robotics, and musculoskeletal modeling. And finally, Paul Frashur, who is an expert in cognitive science, neuroscience, and robotics. And the idea is really to have a lively discussion with the people who you see here, but also with all the audience here, which I would like to warmly welcome. I know there are people joining from Japan, from Europe, from the US, from all over the place. So big thanks for people being late at Japan and people being early up in the US. So welcome everyone, and all participants will be welcome to ask questions through the Slido chat, which I'll mention a bit later on. So personally, I'm super excited by this symposium because I guess there are no more interesting fields of research in engineering and science than robotics and neuroscience. These are really cool fields to study. And I think they're related because they are both interested in understanding how an agent can perceive and move in complex environments, and also how an agent can learn, plan, and improve performance over time. Of course, neuroscience studies animals and humans to understand how it works there. And robotics tries to design agents, but I think there can be beautiful interaction between these two fields. And I think the interactions are really mutually beneficial in the sense that neuroscience can provide inspiration for perception algorithms in robotics, control architectures, and learning methods. And in return, robotics can be a wonderful scientific tool for neuroscience. For instance, to study this notion of embodiment, physical interaction, and seeing how physical interaction affects perception, movements, and learning. And also to test hypotheses in a closed loop, like hypotheses about the organization and function of neural circuits. And what's very important is being able to do these what-if scenarios, playing with the building blocks, do experiments that are not possible or not ethically allowed on animals. And I think that's really a beautiful contribution of robotics and neuromechanical simulations in general. So today, I hope we'll have a nice discussion and examples of some research happening in this interaction. So what will happen is we'll have very short talks, only 10 minutes, with the first talks by Alain and Yasuo. Then we do already a short break of discussions of these two presentations with input from the front row and from all the members. And then the 2 more talks by Scott and myself. And finally, for the last 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, we'll have really an open discussion with not only the front row participants, but also all of you members of the audience assisting to this. And here, please use the Slido chat. So you should have received a link in the announcement. If not, just go to the website ifrr.org. You can find the link to the Slido. And Slido is a very nice tool to propose questions and even vote on the best questions. And I'll monitor that website to then also transmit your questions to everyone in the room. Okay, so again, welcome everyone. I hope people in Japan are still awake and people in the US are also awake with coffee in the hands. Let's start now, and I will now share the screen and invite Alain to start his presentation. So Alain, the screen is yours. I stop sharing now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this nice event. I have not too many slides. They are a bit complex, but I have chosen, because we have only 10 minutes, to put the information on the slides so that offline one can get the details of what there is on it. My talk will be about simplifying principles, and I've called this thing Simplexity. Simplexity, as I understand it, is the ensemble of solutions found by living organisms, so that in spite of the complexity of natural processes, the brain can prepare action and project its consequences in the future. These solutions are simplifying principles which allow a treatment of information and situation taking into account past experience and predicting the future. They are neither caricature or shortcut summaries. And the analysis, what we discover when we look at living organisms, is that there are many of such simplifying principles: motives, multiple reference frame, modularity, anticipation, inhibition, redundance, etc. And the idea of the talk and the work we are doing together with my friends, roboticians for many years now, is could these principles be useful for robotics? Maybe or maybe not. Another important concept is vicariousness. The brain can use many different solutions to solve the same problem. This is flexibility. If a deficit, for instance, the brain does not try to repair the lesion systems, it will look for new solutions using the repertoire of available sensory motor systems or create new ones. Now, this also could be shared with robotics. One example, now I'll give you a few examples very quickly over these slides. An example of vicariousness. We have a repertoire of gaze movements, reflexes, the VOR, optokinetics, saccades, pursuits. They have been built by evolution. If we consider the vestibulocular reflex, it can be inhibited, it can be blocked if you put, as shown at the bottom of the slide, by putting Dove prisms on a subject which reverse completely the movement of the world, which then challenges the reflex. And we've shown that actually the brain, in a few seconds, can inhibit the reflex and replace it by another element of the repertoire, saccades and pursuits. It's really remarkable how quickly the brain can use this repertoire of available subsystems. Another example of simplifying principle this time has been what has been shown for movement. If with the hand you draw in the air or on a piece of paper a shape as shown on the left of this slide, then it has been shown by our friends Viviani Stucchi, by Tamar Flash, by Maos, by many people now, Laquaniti, etc., Terziolo, that there is a very strict relation for all natural hand movements between tangential velocity and the radius of curvature. You go quickly when curvature is slow, is small, and you slow down when curvature is faster. This is a very rigid law for all movement, and it is also true, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, for locomotion, which is what we showed in our lab some years ago. So it is a general application of what is being called motor equivalence, meaning that the same principles will apply to any movement you do with whatever efferent system you use. This suggests that there are general laws in the brain which organize these movements. And that's what we've been trying to understand over the years. This could also be useful for robotics. Another of these examples of simplifying laws is the stabilization of the head. Locomotion is an extremely complex system which of course, involves pattern generators, initiation, repertoires of types, integration with posture, navigation, decision-making. Now, how these incredibly complex system has been controlled, and you will have from Ipshare some examples and other colleagues, examples of how the brain and how living organisms do it. What I will show is what is on this picture, which we documented. Locomotion is not controlled from the feet up. It is controlled from the head down with an inertial guidance platform, which is a vestibular system working with vision. The beauty is that the stabilization of the head uses the vestibular system, and that gaze, which is the direction of the optical axis in space, is used by these inertial guidance systems to anchor gaze, as is done in the space in satellites, for instance. And we've worked on this with many of our friends in Pisa, in Japan, and we've been trying over the years to see if this principle could be also useful for robotics. The beauty of this also is that gaze is also guiding locomotor trajectories. You do not guide the trajectories with the feet, you guide with gaze. And this is an example of a recording of the gaze direction, as you can see with these little green lines and the red dots. The red dots are intersection of the gaze on the ground when you turn, and you can see that always gaze anticipates. Locomotor trajectories are controlled top-down from the gaze, then the head, then the trunk, then the feet. A top-down control from the ground. Now, these principles have been implemented in robotics over the years. We've had beautiful collaborations, for instance, with Jean-Paul Lomont, and on this, with the question, does head stabilization contribute to locomotion? Yes, it does. And there are even very recent papers we've done with Mehdi Benaleg, and also I mentioned the new model of Jean-Paul on the rolling man. So this has been inspiring for us, also with some collaborations with Vincent Eward and Dr. Michalska from Canada to actually see exactly what was the interest of this stabilization that could be useful for robotics. What I'd like to show you too is something both new and old. We've wondered with my friend, the mathematician Daniel Benquin, why the otoliths in the vestibular organs have this very strange shape, which you can see here on the left, on the right. And we have made a model which shows that this incredible complex, apparently complex shape is in fact the reflection of the fact that the otolith system is actually not divided, as anatomy seems to show, between succulus and utriculus. What we have suggested in our model, that the real model is a sphere which looks like a tennis ball on which there is, as you know, a line, a cut, and it is a unique 3D, very, very powerful sensor. And we are looking for partners to actually implement, I say that with technology, these unique sensor, of which the two utriculus and stacculus are just the projections. And of course, this is what has happened in evolution, because during evolution from the dinosaurs to the birds, as you can see on the bottom left here, these semicircular canals have improved very much. And this has allowed dinosaurs to start flying and to make of this receptor a very beautiful 3D sensor, which will in the future, if maybe it is implemented in humanoids, allow the humanoids to fly. Okay. Now, we have also worked on trajectories. If you go from one place to another, you can do it this way or this way. Actually, everybody does it this way, which means that there are general optimization principles, which once more, and we've shown with Daniel Benquin and Tamar Flash, that actually these stereotypy, which we have shown in our lab, actually is expressing the fact that the brain uses different non-Euclidean geometries. And this is what is actually our new and more recent, and it will the last point I will make, point is that we are now working on the idea that the brain uses even non-Euclidean geometries to control movement, and that this is why there are these simplifying principles. The problem of geometries we already had seen in the transformation of the geometry between the retina and the superior colliculus, which had been studied physiologically. And we also had collaboration with Cecilia and Paolo on this, trying to implement it to robots. But more generally, we have this theory, which is exposed on this slide, which I cannot go in detail, in which we explain why we think movement timing is probably easier in these apparently more complex geometries. And also, the last thing I show is my recent theory that actually, as has been shown by neurology and now functional imaging, we have different neural networks for different action spaces, for grasping space, body space, near distance space, environmental spaces. And my theory, which we are now working with Daniel Benquin, using also the new mathematical geometries of Grothendieck. Of course, I don't understand the mathematics, but we work together, is that there are different geometries for these different action spaces. And the topos geometry may be a meta geometry, which allows to unify these geometries and allow us to navigate in space. And that is what I wanted to say today. Thank you very much.
Great, fantastic. Thanks a lot, Alain, for this very inspiring talk. And so as I repeat, people, please prepare your questions using Slido. We'll now switch to the talk of Yasuo, and I will be reading the questions that appear on Slido. And after Yasuo's talk, we'll make a short break to already have questions for Alain and for Yasuo. So Yasuo, the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks. I'll share. So do you see the slide?
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Okay, let me start. So my title would be a constructive study of embodied human brain development from fetal period. So my question is, how does human intelligence or mind emerge and develop? When you think about machine learning, we talk about data, loss, what should be the loss or the reward, and what's the task definitions. However, in living organisms, the nature doesn't explicitly give these. So what's the mystery? So then I think continuous development is very important, and the development is not task specific, and it is not optimization to a fixed criteria. Rather, it's about evolving multiple functions from a single system, and it's about the capability to change rather than optimize. And also important thing is the scaffolding, or in other words, bootstrapping. Now, for such a process, I believe in the very initial phase, these three terms are very important: embodiment, emergence, and neuroplasticity. And together, I claim that they form what we call a body shapes brain. Actually, the scenario behind it goes like this. So body and the environment is given in the beginning. And the spinal oscillator is already working in the very early stage of human development, which drives muscles. And then motor patterns emerge. And that's through the physical interaction, through embodiment, the motor patterns are shaped by embodiment. Now, that gives rise to sensory motor information structure. Again, the structure is imposed by the embodiment. And that is, information is captured by neuroplasticity, and then brain connectivity self-organize, and then that again modulate muscle commands, and it goes in a repeated manner. So that's the sort of overall scenario. And to investigate this, we put a lot of effort on building a model, rather accurate body and nervous system model of a human fetus like these. So we collaborated with medical doctors. We got MRI data and anatomical data, 3D scan data, and we put together these into a musculoskeletal body model. And then also we modeled the spinal circuitry. And besides, we got brain data, brain imaging data from doctors, and we analyzed the data to extract the brain connectivity. And we put learning spiking neural network. Here, the learning rule, we adopted STDP, spike timing dependent plasticity, and integrate it into a simulated brain. So when we let the system start, the spinal oscillator system drives the whole body muscles, and then the physical interaction takes place, and then certain motor pattern emerge. And these are some of the data and indices we computed from the resulting motor patterns. And we confirmed that basically the way the limbs are coordinated and the way the complexity emerges really comparable to human behavior. Now, about the brain model, so as I explained before, we computed the connectivity from the brain imaging data, and we designed this layered cortical model. And then we integrated into a 3D cortical model with learning spiking neural network. This movie shows how the spontaneous activity emerges in the simulated brain. In this version, it's got over 5 million neuron models with 25 billion synapses. And we created different age versions of the brain model. And we integrated this brain model with the musculoskeletal body model. So here you'll see simulation results. So now you see a fetus body is moving, and you see the red muscle models. And the movement is completely spontaneous, driven by the spinal circuit. And you see lower glowing spherical area. That's a simulated womb, uterus environment with liquid. And we feed the result into this brain model. Now, here are some results. Here, you see a close-up of a somatosensory cortex model, and you see a clearly segregated body map is acquired here, leg, trunk, arm, head. And this is from the typical development scenario in the womb. We also did a comparative experiment with what we call ex utero condition, where we put the same model on not in the uterus, but on a flat bed in the air, and let it move, and then fed that data to the cortical model, let it learn. So you'll see a clear difference. And in the ex utero learning, the body map is much less significant and less segregated and so on. So we clearly see that the difference of the environment affects a lot this initial learning process about its self-body. This is due to the information structure, actually correlational structure of the proprioception and tactile signals. in the liquid or in the air. So we did further experiments on bimodal integration. So we took one brain which learned in utero and the other brain which learned through ex utero, and then fed a vision and proprioception stimuli as if the baby is moving its hand in front of the eyes. So the baby feels proprioception and the vision at the same time. Now, if you feed it to the typically developed brain, you observe a strong bimodal responses. So it's basically integrating these two, visual and proprioception, into information. However, if you do the same thing to the ex-utero learned brain, you see very little of this such integration. So this is interesting that somehow the experience in utero is playing a very important role, not just in the immediate body map learning, but also further multimodal integration. So this is actually somehow related to the medical issues. There are lots of reports from cohort study about preterm birth in developmental disorders. Shortly, preterm babies have higher risks of ASD and ADHD and other developmental disorders. But the reason is really controversial. However, another findings from other groups says that with ASD children, if you make a functional brain imaging, ASD children have weaker somatosensory representation about their body. So these all are seemingly connected, and our research might suggest the sort of missing link about the relationship with fetal learning and ASD or social cognition. Further study, we did a lot of things about other developmental aspects, but this is one of them. So we took a real baby movement and let our model move as just like the baby, and then collected all the data, proprioception and all data, let the brain learn, and computed how the amount of information integration changes after sensory motor learning. And this clearly shows that after learning in the red, the integration of information increases. And this is the indicator using the theory by Giulio Tononi in theory of consciousness. So I have a further scenario starting from the very initial fetal period, starting with the self-body map creation, but then as the environment slightly changes, the body grows, the nature of signals changes, and then this leads to further recognition, body object distinction, causality, self-other distinction, voluntary motion, and then based on these, further cognitive functions towards social cognition emerge. That's the hypothetical scenario. We are also experimenting with a baby robot. This is a baby robot called Nobi with whole body motion capability, with whole body tactile sensors and audio-visual sensing. And so that you can do experiments with real objects, real humans in a realistic environment to collect all the data so that we can feed it to the simulated brain. To conclude, so we showed the effect of sensory motor learning in early brain development. And there we had to simulate a complex embodied interaction, and that leads to a certain information structure that is learned by the brain. But this is a contribution of robotics. We can only see such structure by doing the simulation. And we also could do the what if scenarios. like the ex utero development, which never can be done with the real humans. But it gives us a new insight. And our simulation could be an experimental tool for testing various environmental conditions in early development. And so we are talking about various possibilities with the medical doctors. And for AI or robotics, our approach might contribute in terms of finding out the initial set of conditions for continuous development. Okay, so that's all for my talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Yasuo, for a fascinating talk and a very impressive baby robot. So yeah, let's open up. Let's take, as mentioned, we'll take a few questions here after these two talks, and I'd like to give the chance to our front row participants to just open the mic and ask the question or make their comments to what they have seen just now.
Yeah, so just to Paul for sure here.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. Right, these are important principles of development, and I guess you're suggesting that we should think about training robots in a comparable way, right? But then
Right.
in some sense, why have we made so little progress in achieving that? What are the obstacles we're facing in taking more this motor babbling approach toward training of robots?
That's a serious question. But before that, let me just confirm that, of course, if you want a very high performance in a particular task, you would take a machine learning approach, and you know that it's been successful. However, here, what we are talking about is that maybe we should do the other way. So in the real world applications, probably the task definition is not fixed and always changing. And so we need somehow the methods to make the robot continuously adaptive to various things. Now, back to the question. Right. First of all, what we need is a system that is capable of moving from one stage to another, acquiring not just one capability, but then based on that to further acquire more complex strategy. And I haven't seen much example of, successful example of that. But in our research, we've done at least 2 steps. So without any specific design or tuning, our model actually acquired first one pattern in this fetus, abrupt motion. And then based on that, the system autonomously proceeded to acquire self-touch motion. So this is one example of how the system could be able to go step by step further. We need some further mechanism for autonomously acquire hierarchical representations. Also drives, like there are many work on intrinsic motivations, but somehow to drive the system towards new experiences and new skills. So yeah, well, that's all I can say now, and I have to agree that that's a very serious issue in developmental robotics.
Great, thanks a lot. I suggest maybe if someone has a question to Alain from the front row, and maybe a comment. Sorry, Cecilia. Before it's great. I see people using the Slido chat. It's great. So please continue, and you have this option to vote for good questions. So that helps me then to give a priority. So keep doing that, and I'll then use some Slido questions. So yeah, please go ahead, Cecilia.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank Professor Bertos publicly, because I think that you are the scientist from neuroscience who gave us the best lessons for robotics. And I think that's a great contribution that we had. And I personally, thank you, because you taught us to see things differently in robotics, to see the difference between the way we build robots and especially the way we want to control them and their behavior, the sensory motor behavior, and the way it works in human brains, but of course it is true also in other animals. So what I think is the main lesson is this concept of simplifying principle. So we shouldn't simplify the system, I mean, our robots, and this is what we usually do. we build robots that are much, much, much simpler than living beings. And we shouldn't simplify the environments, which is also something that we do in robotics, because, I mean, robotics was born for structured environments. So we know that very well. We know very well that it's difficult to have a robot behaving in real world, what we call real world. And that's a fantastic lesson. What we should find are simplifying principles to make a complex system work in a complex environment. And you showed us also many of those principles. You mentioned some today, Simplexity, which contains many things, prediction, and we also implemented some of them. But then when I see, I mean, recent developments of robotics, I see that those elegant, beautiful solutions that we find in nature are not applied so often in robotics. I mean, in robotics, we go for brute force approaches. Just let me give a clear example. Vision, computer vision, it progressed a lot in recent years. And vision involves a large amount of data, and it's computationally expensive. But in nature, we find beautiful, elegant solutions for simplifying the processing of images and also the understanding of images. But what we did in robotics, or I mean, computer vision in general, is just to buy more powerful computers. And it works. So we don't need to, I mean, to use those elegant and cheap and effective, let's say, biologically inspired solutions, because we just, with brute force, increase the number of data and the computation that we can do. So I still think it's not the right way to go. I mean, it works, but in the long term, it's just a waste of computation, a waste of that. So coming to a sort of question, is more common than a question, as you see, but why do you think roboticists still do not apply this elegant print? Is it because, I mean, roboticists are difficult to convince, or because we still miss the right models to implement, or we miss the technologies to implement those models?
Thank you. As you know, all my philosophy, which is also the philosophy of Paulo Dario, is cross-fertilization. The idea that we have as much to learn from roboticians as roboticians may have to learn from biology. It's really this cross-fertilization, which is very important, because by contrast with mathematical models on computer, what roboticians do is they have to deal with reality. Well, you have to deal with forces now. This is what I like just to insist, because time is going very fast. If I may, on my last two slides, the brain and evolution is using different geometries for different action spaces, because it is not the same problem to act on one's body, or to take a cup on the table, or to walk in a room, or to think about coming back home. And these geometries in the modern sense, this is what I learned from my friends, mathematicians, these geometries include forces. And you know, the work of Yoshi Nakamura, etc., and others have been in this direction too. So yeah, here again, we have to understand, because we have different networks in the brain for different spaces. This is what fMRI neurophysiology has shown us. When I go from my table cup to walk, I change network, which this may be for the future interesting, and it will require collaboration between the roboticians and AI and the biologists. C'est tout. Voilà. You know,
Yes,
I'm very
we
old,
have-
so I have to work for the future. And we have with you and Paolo Dario proposed 10 years ago to Europe a project on that. It's a pity we didn't get it. Maybe
definitely so.
this colloquium, we will have an international collaboration on many geometries for many action spaces from the baby robot. And I'd like to say something to Yasuo Koneyoshi. Your beautiful presentation makes me think of Rodolfo Linas, who 30 years ago, as you know, noticed in rats that baby rats started having little jerks. Rodolfo published a paper saying that what is first is probably production by the brain of a jerk, which is measured by proprioception, feeding back and specifying in the spinal cord the model of the muscle. So your work is a beautiful development of this very original finding of Rodolfo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just jump in. Great discussion. Let's maybe keep it a bit shorter, otherwise we will too rapidly fill the 90 minutes. But I'm very grateful for the audience who asked good questions. There are 8 of them. I'll just pick one, which is the most popular so far, by Changqiao Liu for Yasuo. The question is, how did you determine the connection between the brain model and the body? So I guess it's, did you constrain it, or is it just open-ended?
Oh, yeah. In that particular experiment, we constrained it. And actually, we took basically a biological and anatomical data. And so we fed it through the thalamus model, and then the somatosensory signals fed to roughly the somatosensory area. But not, of course, we don't specify the exact point, but it's like it's spread out into in a broad area with smart sensory, and each sensory signals are overlapping there, and let the neural system sort of learn to segregate. You know, that's how we did it.
Super. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great. I think it's the right time maybe now to continue the presentations, and Lara, Brenna, and Yoshi, you will have time for afterwards if you don't mind. So I suggest, Scott, maybe you go ahead and share your screen and give your presentation.
Good. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for the first 2 presentations. That was really exciting and interesting. We all know that understanding human movement is challenging. And my point is that simulations complement experimental measurements of movement to provide insight into the dynamics and neural control of typical movement and the causes of movement disorders. So for the past 10 years, my group's been developing a software package called OpenSim, and there are now thousands of researchers who have used OpenSim to understand the mechanics of pathological gait and cerebral palsy, the effects of weakness and aging, and how wearable robotics can assist walking and running. So what I want to do over the next 10 minutes is just to give you a flavor for what the software is and what people have done with the software that really brings together neurodynamical simulation and clinical applications in robotics. So just to give you a quick overview, OpenSim is a musculoskeletal simulator where you can model the dynamics of assistive devices. You can put probes on models to assess ligament forces, joint contact forces, to assess the stretch and energy of in muscle and tendon. You can individualize models to the structure of individual people or individual robots. And of course, you need to represent biological joints, things like shoulders and knees that we don't usually build into robots, but certainly live in humans and animals. And the biggest challenge, of course, is neural control. So that's what I want to focus on today. So a simulation in OpenSim begins with neural control, and that neural controller sends excitations out to models of muscle and tendon dynamics Those muscle forces act on the musculoskeletal geometry. And then there's a multi-body dynamics engine that integrates movements. And you can have reflex controllers and a central nervous system controllers. And what's exciting from a scientific point of view is that any point you can access all these internal variables and report what muscle forces are, what energetic response is, what the excitations are of individual muscles, what the signals are in muscle spindles. It's also an application. So there's a graphical user interface that allows you to visualize the model and generate simulations of movement. And you can, this provides a variety of ways for people to interact with musculoskeletal simulations and the reports that you can produce. There's also a repository of models. You see these models are actually can take years to develop. So for example, Matt Demers developed this model of individual landing on an inclined surface. And Matt was interested in assessing injury risk. So there are models of the ligaments about the ankle, the reflex controllers that come into play when you land on a surface like this. Cat Steele developed a model of crouch gait. So this is a common gait pattern that is adopted by children with cerebral palsy, and we want to understand the mechanics of crouch gait. AJ Seth developed this really beautiful model of the shoulder that allows you to track the motions of bones from external landmarks, which is quite challenging. And this model rejects much of the noise that results from using surface markers. And of course, there are models of various animals, tyrannosaurs, ostriches, guinea fowl, that we can use to complement experimental approaches. Now, for the most part, there's a worldwide community that has been built mostly in bioengineering and biophysics and computation. But now robotics and neuroscience has really contributed to the growth of the number of users of the software. And it really is a community, so that people, when they develop a new control algorithm, they make it available and that whole worldwide community can adopt it. If there's a new model of a finger, for example, or of a bipedal robot, you can post that model and immediately 40,000 people can adopt it and use it. So the idea is to accelerate science with this open source resource. So let me give you just a couple examples that link neuroscience and robotics. And the first relates to the design of assistive devices. So Tom Yoshida, who was in my group and is now in the University of Ottawa, used OpenSim to explore the ideal device to reduce the metabolic cost of running. He found that the optimal device torque profile doesn't usually match the net joint moments that are generated by muscles, but instead he found a unique profile. So then Lee and his colleagues in Connor Walsh's group at Harvard applied these findings to see if it could improve the design of an actual device. And this bar plot shows the results. So what's plotted is the net metabolic cost of running. Here's the cost with the suit powered off. That costs a little bit more than running without a suit. But if you use scaled biological torques here, you do get a savings with respect to the powered off and with respect to no suit. But we could apply those simulation optimized torques and get a much larger reduction than you could by just scaling what muscles are doing. And I bring this up in this simple example to note that the interplay between the wearable robotic system and the human neuromusculoskeletal system is incredibly complex. So as wearable robots get more complex where they're actuating multiple joints, it's almost impossible to do these experiments. They're day-long or week-long experiments with subjects coming back to do a human in the loop optimization. So what we really want to do is run those experiments and simulation to identify the most promising strategies for wearable robotic systems and then apply those results experimentally as I've shown here. So another application is simulating muscle impairments in surgery. So Carmichael Ong developed this simulation of severe gastrocnemius contracture. So what you see, gastrocnemius is a muscle that crosses the ankle, and contracture produces excessive passive force in that muscle. And when you do that, you get walking on the toes. Carmichael could then simulate a gastrocnemius tendon lengthening surgery and see that, in fact, when the only problem is gastrocnemius contracture, this particular surgery restores normal walking. Now, I'm giving this simple example, but most impairments are more complex than this, and the simulation can play a key role in identifying the cause of the impairment and the optimal treatments. It also allows you a simulation playground to test various hypotheses for what is generating movement. Now, one common hypothesis that is that we minimize the cost of transport during locomotion. And in fact, we do minimize the cost of transport in many instances. But if your objective is only to minimize the cost of transport, you get gait that looks something like this, which is pretty obvious. It doesn't look like a natural gait. And if you compare it to experimental data, it doesn't represent natural gait. We also try to avoid injury. So we don't want to injure our joints and hyperextend our knees. And that looks a little bit more physiologic. But as we saw in an earlier talk, maintaining the stability of gaze and head stability is also critically important. So if you add that to the objective function, then you get a much more natural looking gait. So the nice thing about the simulations is you can explore these and isolate one effect at a time and see what's really coming into play and the relative importance of these components of our neuro objective. Now, modern reinforcement learning methods are being used to generate motions. This is the results of the DeepMind project reported just a couple years ago. One of the challenges, if you don't have a physiologic model, you get non-physiologic motions. So one of the things that we've been pursuing at NeuroIPS is over the last 3 years, we've run challenges with over 1,000 participants and 6,000 submissions of neural controllers that bring computer science, roboticists, and the biomechanics communities together to generate more realistic controls. So reinforcement learning is a promising method for generating natural movements in complex dynamic situations. Another is direct collocation. We just recently introduced MoCo, which is a open source tool for using direct collocation to control a neuromusculoskeletal model. And we encourage you to explore that, use it in your own research. I want to finish by just thanking the various funding agencies that make this possible and all the collaborations that have been enabled by this work.
Great, thanks a lot for a fantastic talk, very beautiful. I'll suggest I will straight away follow up and then we continue with the discussion. So, I'm happy of your talks, Scott, because we're very much inspired with what you do in what we do in my lab as well on human locomotion. So here we are. So this is the last talk. I like to talk a bit of how in my lab, the biorobotics lab at EPFL, we use robots and also neuromechanical simulation tools to investigate animal locomotion. Because the more I work in robotics, the more I'm really impressed and fascinated by animal locomotion. The fact that the nervous system can control in real time 300 muscles, solve a very high multidimensional problem, very nonlinear with hybrid dynamics, it's super impressive. And I think robotics can help to decode a bit how this works. As a first approximation, the key ingredients are this clever musculoskeletal system that we have seen in all the presentations before. I think the body is already well designed to solve part of the locomotion control problem. Then there's a spinal cord. I think the spinal cord is often underestimated, even in neuroscience, but it's really the main controller for locomotion. And it has the peripheral nervous system that provides many reflexes to react to perturbations. And this very interesting concept of central pattern generators. These are neural oscillators which by themselves can produce patterns that already look like good locomotion patterns. And it's like a feed-forward controller for locomotion. Then obviously you have all the modulation coming from higher parts of the brain that will modulate all the time this activity in the spinal cord for feet placement, for balance, and for timing of sequences. And I really like this image of Jerry Lubb, who sees the spinal cord with a musculoskeletal system like a puppet on strings, where by playing with a limited set of descending pathways, like these blue arrows, you can generate periodic and discrete movement and superimpose them and sequence them over time, like a bit building motor primitives for movements. And these days in my lab, we concentrate quite a lot on the spinal cord and this beautiful interaction between the peripheral nervous system, meaning the reflexes, and the central nervous system, especially this CPG circuits. And my talk will be high level, so I don't have time to go in details, but each time I'll give you pointers for papers that look a bit more into this. But here my message is really, I feel that robotics and modeling are key to understand this interaction. It's such a complex nonlinear interaction that I think almost only modeling and robotics can help to decode it properly, at least for sure to contribute to neuroscientific understanding. So in my lab, we have the hypothesis that the respective role of these different components has changed during evolution. And to test this, we make mathematical models of spinal cord circuits at different levels of abstraction. And we couple them to robots to have real physics, to close the loop with real physics. And today I'll very briefly present some results on salamander locomotion and then on human locomotion. So salamanders are beautiful, very old animals. They are older than dinosaurs and everything. They are really representative of the first animals that switched to terrestrial locomotion. So it's very important to understand how they are organized because they're a bit our ancestors also of humans. And what's interesting is this bimodal locomotion, this ability to switch between swimming and walking, and the fact that this is really a spinal cord mechanism. A distributed animal can walk or swim with simple electrical stimulation of the spinal cord. So in some older work, we made models of this with testing the hypothesis that by starting with a swimming circuit that we believe the animal has inherited during evolution, we explored how you could add new oscillatory centers for the limbs and be able to get these gait transitions from swimming to walking. And for that, we developed this central pattern generator model and tested that in a robot to see if we could generate the gait transition and also modulate the locomotion. And here I think this is the beauty of the spinal cord. It has these central pattern generators that with just playing with two strings, in this case, we can control speed, heading, and even type of gait. Like if we stimulate at a low level, we have the walking gait. And if we pass a threshold, we have a swimming gait. So that means that, and this is just feed-forward control. It's really the central pattern generators without yet feedback loops. So one message is indeed that central pattern generators can, in principle, produce really complex locomotion and modulate many aspects needed of locomotion. But obviously, we have sensory feedback. And obviously, you can generate rhythms either by more being centrally driven, like oscillator driven on the right, CPGs, or you can have feedback loops that generate rhythms. And interestingly, this is a very old debate, more than 100 years old, where Sherrington was seeing more locomotion as a chain of reflexes, where you have rhythms coming being sensory driven. And Graham Brown, who was his PhD student, he was seeing more like neural oscillators producing the rhythms and then maybe feedback incorporating it a bit, but mainly centrally driven. And this is still a debate between peripheral and central control, and basically feedback control and feed-forward control, where I think roboticists and modeling can help to decode what really happens in animals. And obviously, to make the link between the two, you need the body, and the key, the bridge is the body. And here, all this influence of the biomechanics is super important. And this beautiful video of Steve Collins' Passive Walker shows that in principle, a mechanical system without actuator or sensors can locomote. So you could have a pure biomechanical system that can do some simple locomotion. And the same for swimming. Here you see a trout swimming in a chain of vortices. And this is happens to be a dead trout. It's a pure, simple viscoelastic system. It has no control, and it still can benefit from the vortices. So these messages are the biomechanics already do some part of the locomotion. So in my lab, in a project funded by the Human Frontier Science Project, together with Akio Ishiguro and Emily Standen, we're exploring a bit this role of sensory feedback complementing oscillators, with a hypothesis that in quite different animals, like the polypteros, which is an amphibious fish, salamander, and even some amphibious centipedes, there's a very important role of local oscillators, but also of sensory feedback playing a very important role for coordinating these oscillators, more than direct coupling in the system. So it's really sensory-driven coupling rather than direct coupling that generate patterns. So it's a hypothesis. And I don't have time to go in detail, but for instance, for the salamander, we're finding that we can have isolated oscillators without direct coupling. So like a CPG cut in small parts that really relies on sensory feedback signals to coordinate the rhythms. And we can demonstrate that both for walking and for swimming. So that's nice because that means sensory feedback doesn't just only do perturbation handling, but also pattern formation. It can synchronize oscillators and it can provide patterns. And that's nice because that means you have a beautiful redundancy. And I like the concept of vicariousness that Alain mentioned, that you have a beautiful redundancy between the peripheral system and the central system that provide a very strong robustness, for instance, against lesions. I don't have time to show the details, but you can lesion the system quite a bit and you still have locomotion because you have two parallel mechanisms which are well integrated to handle locomotion. Now, and by the way, I have some openings, so PhD and postdoc positions. If you're interested, please come to me related to this Salamander project. Now we have the hypothesis that during evolution, the role of CPGs has probably decreased quite a bit in mammals because locomotion became more unstable. You need much more state information and much more reflexes. And you need also more descending modulation for carefully feet placement for keeping balance. And there's even a bit of question of whether or not humans have CPGs. There's good evidence for it, but there's no direct observation. So here again, modeling can help to guide this. And we have seen beautiful examples. So here on the right is the model that Scott presented in OpenSim and SCONE with Ong et al. We were also very much influenced by a very nice older model by Hartmut Geyer and Hugh Hare, which was a beautiful sensory-driven model. No CPGs, only sensory feedback, and it could generate beautiful locomotion, which for me was very annoying because I was originally a CPG person. So I was a bit annoyed to see that you could do so good locomotion by purely having only sensory feedback chains, no neural oscillators. But with my lab, we were sitting together to see what could be a benefit of adding a CPG, a neural oscillator, feed-forward component to such a system. And we came up with several hypotheses. The main one being it helps to control speed. The second main one, it handles robustness for sensory noise and sensory failure. And here very briefly, because I'm running out of time, I briefly show what we did on the control of speed. Because in Hugh Hare's model, you need to change many gains in a very complex way to change speed. All these reflex gains have to be changed, so it's a very difficult control problem. Here, what Florian did, the PhD student, was build on top of the very nice model, sensory-driven model of Hugh Hare and Hartmut Geyer, adding the CPG component, which could then be modulated with a few control signals to modulate frequency and amplitude. And like similarly to what Scott was showing, we run an optimization to find parameters. We minimize a few criteria, and surprisingly, very rapidly, in few generations, you get good looking gates. And just a few control buttons were sufficient basically to control speed. Just basically increasing the frequency of the oscillator will go to faster mode, and then you have a very simple control of speed. So here, basically, we feel that, again, it's redundant, but adding a CPG to the system is useful, and you have a beautiful redundancy and complementarity between peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. So almost finished. This is clearly also useful for robotics, because it can provide this low-level robust controller, where and it's also the beauty of the spinal cord. It's when we locomote, we never think about it, because we have all these reflexes and very strong robustness at a low level, implemented by the spinal cord for handling all kind of perturbations. And it's only if you have a very big perturbation, as you'll see later on, that you need more complex modulation and you need your high part of the brain. So don't give up your high part of the brain, it's still useful, but for steady state locomotion, it's not always necessary. Okay, so take home messages. Don't underestimate the spinal cord. It has beautiful, sophisticated circuits to do many things needed for rich motor behavior. And like also Alain mentioned, there's this beautiful redundancy and complementarity between peripheral and nervous system that are really good friends. And we have this hypothesis that the respective role have changed during evolution. And finally, for robotics, I think this can provide good, robust fault-tolerant controllers at a low level, on top of which do higher level things like navigation and other things. Okay, so I hope I was not too long. I'd like to thank the people in the lab, and if you would like to see the videos or get the papers, please type BioRob EPFL and you should be able to find us. Okay, so I hope this was clear enough. And well, now I'd like to open up the discussion to everyone. And especially I would love to hear from Laura, Brenna, and Yoshi, who we haven't heard yet. So maybe Laura, if you have a question or comment for anyone, it doesn't need to be to the two last talks, but I'd like you to give you a chance to talk a bit.
Okay, yeah, sure. I have a question for Scott. Also, maybe it's more, yeah, a thought. So I find this this software that you presented very useful, because you can decide on technology based on objective measures, such as, for example, effort of speed. But I wonder, are we really finding the best solutions? Because we humans are very complex being, right? And there are a lot of psychological factors that affects how we interact with robots. And all these psychological things usually are not taken into account in this software. So an example, we were working with an exoskeleton for locomotion, and we wanted to reduce the inertia. We wanted to reduce the friction, everything, in order to make the walking much more transparent. So we had different controllers, we compared them, and actually what we found is that people prefer the one who didn't have compensated inertia, because they were using the inertia of the robot in order to help them to walk. So this is something that I believe that it's more into the psychological level. So do you foresee how could we somehow involve all this into a much more broader concept? So instead of reaching a local minima, we are going into the global. So also considering other factors.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's more a matter of what you put in your objective function and how well you can formulate mathematical models of these psychological variables. And that can be quite challenging. So, but you can put in these non-physiologic measures and put them into an objective function, and your model will do different things. That said, I think that the combination of simulation and experiments, for example, with human-in-the-loop optimization, where the humans are going to take those into account, and actual humans are going to optimize, and the example you provided is fantastic. So I think simulation is limited in certain ways, and I think we have to do the human experiments to complement the simulations, just the way the simulations complement the human experiments.
Yeah, thanks.
I should say too that once we do the experiment, you can upgrade the simulation to include the things that the humans discovered that you didn't anticipate.
For me, the problem is that sometimes it seems like we found the best solution by chance, right? So if we do all the simulations somehow, we are restricting ourselves to this. Yeah, there is not going to be chance to find this solution. So it's like we are not exploring enough all the possible solutions by restraining ourselves to these simulations. But yeah, I mean, it's the equilibrium between both things. Yeah.
Great.
And
so maybe let's hear from Brenna, if it's the right time for you, Brenna. I know you have your kids around.
Yeah, thanks. It is a good time. And actually, my question is for you, okay? So I'm very interested in this idea of simplified control and the puppet string analogy that you talked about and all the different layers of control. And I'm interested in this from the perspective of what it could mean for human teleoperation of robots. So as you well know, we don't have great interfaces for high degree of freedom control of humanoid robots, for example. And as we think about sort of assistive robots that are maybe shared control with humans, we have this compound, or even if it's not shared control, we have this compound where more complex or more severe motor impairments often require more complex assistance. And if that requires more complex control, you have this issue of how you actually capture those more complex control signals from a human whose body actually is able to generate less control signals perhaps than someone without an injury. And so what I'm interested to hear your thoughts about is whether or not there are sort of takeaway messages on how to approach this in a bit more principled way, where we have to sort of think about what's intuitive for the human, but also what's capable for the robotics autonomy in the robot. But it would be great if it wasn't always just one-off design solutions for each individual robot platform or impairment in terms of whether the robotics autonomy and human autonomy, what each should be controlling.
Yeah, so great question, and also a good scientific question, because for me it's still not obvious how as humans we can switch between just steady state locomotion where you don't think about it to more fine-tuned modulation of your hands, of your body, dancing, things where you start to modulate extensively your spinal cord activity. So to answer a bit, I would love to have like an interface between a robot and a human, which looks a bit like strings, and maybe with a bit of training, you have an interface. Instead of a joystick, you would have a few set of descending strings representing like a puppet. And maybe we need to learn how to remote control something, but it's a bit what our higher part of the brain does with the spinal cord. So indeed, it could be a useful interface. And my intuition would be that our higher part of the brain sometimes switch between spaces, like what Alain also mentioned. Sometimes we switch into Cartesian space. What's important is the end effector. Sometimes it's the whole body posture. So by playing with different set of strings and possibly different internal models, our brain is able to do that. And it could possibly be useful for teleoperation. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, Alain, if you agree with what I just said or if you disagree.
Oh, fine. Fine.
Fine. Okay, like it. Okay, so I'm glad to hear that. Okay, super. Yeah, super.
Yoshi
Yeah.
Nakamura had a question.
Yeah.
Yes,
let's
yes.
Yoshi. Yeah, please go ahead, Yoshi.
Well, my question is a bit abstract, but it's related to the question is going to Alain and Og. I think Alain's talk is always very stimulating to me, and the simplicity and the complexity. They are the very mysterious aspect of the biological system, particularly for humans. And I think the simple system can be quite easily formulated as some optimization. But the robustness is very hard to describe mathematically. I think in the case of Og's talk, the CPG is one mechanism that can bring the robustness of mobility, right? And there is some mathematical, of course, the explanation about its robustness or generalizations. But for more wider sense, how the biological system is getting the robustness. Can we somehow mathematically describe the principle, or is it only obtained by data-based learning over many generations? That's my question to Alain and maybe Og.
Alain, you want to start?
Well, as you know, I am not a mathematician, although I'm an engineer.
Me neither.
So I can only tell you what I am been working with mathematicians, mostly recently. Yes, well, we have shown, when I say we, they have shown, Tamar, Flash, and Aquaniti, and they have shown that you can make a mathematical formula which describes the relation between tangent velocity and curvature, which is the basic law of any movement, of the implementation, not what happens in the brain. And we have with Tamar this paper also with Maos on the extension to 3D. So, and what we are working now with Daniel Benquin, who is probably one of the greatest mathematicians for geometry in France, is the idea that there is a possibility by using the topos theory of Grothendieck, as I mentioned, and to have a mathematical formulation of these geometries, sub-geometries, which concern the body scheme. You know, we know we have in the temporal-parietal cortex a body scheme, which is what a second self. So what is the geometry in which this body scheme is working? It's very important because most of the pathology of locomotion is not physical. It's we know now that it's a pathology of the working of this body scheme, which then gives apparent locomotor movement. But we don't even know the geometry in which this is working. The same thing, we know a lot now concerning navigation. Well, the Nobel Prize was given to John O'Keefe, and we have many ideas about how the hippocampus stores these things, etc. But basically, we don't have a general theory of that. And of course, the brain program in Europe has also this as an aim. I believe that probably it is very useful to have mathematical models of that. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask a question in relation to this, maybe, to Scott and Auk. In your two modeling for humans, mostly Scott, do you take into account the coplanar variation? That is the demonstration which has been made by Laquaniti and confirmed for babies, for development too, that during development, there is a development of this phase locking between the angles of elevation of the limbs, of the legs, foot, shank, hip, as had been shown before for arm movements, the phase locking between, because this is a very well identified relation now, which probably is coordinated by a model inside the spinal cord, allowing the brain not to control many muscles, but just give a general parameter, which is in the old theory of Bernstein. So are you taking into account this coplanar variation law in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way we do controllers in OpenSim is that you can have any controller you want with or without phase lock. I would say a majority don't take that into account, but some do. And it's really the smart ones who are trying to simplify the coordination and control problem rather than just throwing computers at it that do take into account these kinds of coupling in the controller. We don't constrain what people do for their controller. We allow any form to control the multi-body dynamic system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I don't know if Yasuo Koniyoshi knows the paper on the from Ivanenko and Laquaniti group together with Sharon, showing that the baby has not this coplanar variation. It is genetically coded, but it is specified by experience of the baby. So at the beginning, so you are aware of that. It would be very interesting to know if tactile input is very important in the timing, because maybe this coordination requires, maybe in cerebellum, coordination of timing in the oscillators.
Yeah, don't forget to unmute, Yasuo. I see your lips moving, but we don't hear you.
We don't have an answer to this yet. We are aware of that, but first, in our model, we do not explicitly implement explicit circuitry for phase coordination. Rather, we started without them. And what our point was to, how the embodied interactions can give rise to a certain phase relationship, and that can be acquired through neuroplasticity. But of course, like Alan pointed out, that kind of stuff is one of the things we can do next. Assuming certain genetically prepared circuitry and see what triggers that at the right point in the development. What are the conditions for these triggering, and how that contributes to the development is also very important question, I think.
Great.
But can I make one comment about back to Yoshi's questions?
Yeah, and then I suggest we take some questions from the audience. But go ahead. Yeah.
My version of the answer would be, as I said in my talk, let's look at the problem like a control or anything, not as the optimization. Because if you apply optimization, you're talking about the fixed criteria, fixed goal evaluation function. And that means the solution becomes sort of non-robust, because if the boundary conditions change, the solution is not anymore optimal. So rather, I would say try to come up with a different idea of, design a system that is capable of as much variety as possible. So one of our work, so rather than optimizing to certain criteria, but forget about that and then do as much as possible different things. So one of our model using chaotic maps, that was we call it a behavior emergence model, but what it actually does, no optimization, but it just gets entrained to arising dynamics, but then situation changes, immediately get entrained into that. So there's somewhat like Aoki's, center pattern generator without explicit relationship.
Mm-hmm. So probably that is exactly the point of my question. The learning from many trials or many experiments or evolution, that is the, of course, the strategy of biological system. So, but my question is, can we model and make some mathematical approach to that kind of robustness? I just wonder if there's any.
Maybe my answer would be to look at the basin of attraction. So have an idea of the envelope in a multidimensional space. How's the volume of attraction? The bigger, the more robust against sensory noise and things like that. So mathematically, but that's empirically explored. It cannot be mathematically expressed, but the volume for me of the basin of attraction will be a notion of robustness. Mm-hmm. There are some very good questions from the audience, and I would like to give them the chance to ask them. So help me, by the way, by voting. That helps me to sequence them. One very good question for all of us, not only the panelists, but also front row. what do you see as the most fundamental difference between locomotion and manipulation? And I may want to add what you see as similarities. I think it's a very good question. Who like to take it? Anyone here in the room?
Just a quick answer, locomotion is cyclic, whereas manipulation typically is not.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah. But it can be drumming. There can be things. I'll say upper limbs could be also rhythmic. But you're right. Normally, it's the difference. Yeah. For me, I find it's a very good question because if I look at a squirrel or many quadruped animals are very good at locomotion and very good at manipulation. And I would love to know if the same neural circuitry are used for both or not. My prediction is that the upper limbs are often reusing the same circuits for both. So for visually guided feet placement and for manipulation, my prediction would be that we use the same control circuits, at least some sub parts, but it's an intuition, let's say. I don't know what other people think.
I think the locomotion is targeting the robustness, but manipulation is targeting the precision. Probably that's the difference.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, I would say, as I mentioned, we know now that there are general rules, which are similar for both. I would disagree with the idea that there would be only oscillation involved in locomotion, because we know that hand movements are controlled by a 10 Hertz oscillation in the inferior olive. So the difference would be the frequency of the oscillators which are involved. All movements are controlled by coupled oscillators, but the oscillators which involved in manipulation are different maybe than those involved in the locomotor pattern, but it's still a general principle of oscillation at different frequencies. And the last is, once more, I'm sorry, it's going to be a problem of geometry, because the two types of movements do not address the same forces and spaces in the world. So then the geometries, in the deep sense of geometry, have to be different. Because of gravity is not involved in the control of the hand as gravity is involved in the control of locomotion.
Yeah.
So this is what we are trying, with all modesty, to understand with Daniel. There is a need for different sub-geometry of the generalized geometry because the relation with the world and forces and spaces are different. So the sub-geometries involved are going to be different. C'est ça l'idée. We can't show anything yet, but we have a paper. I can send the papers to anybody.
Super, yeah. Another interesting question is a bit more technical from Matai Hoffman for Scott and Yasuo to know what do you think are differences between the OpenSim simulation and the fetal simulator from Yasuo, and whether there are also tactile sensing in the Scott in OpenSim's model. So I don't know if you are aware of each other's difference or similarities.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do the comparison. There's probably a lot of overlap and a lot of strengths and differences between the two. You can certainly incorporate sensory feedback in an OpenSim model.
Well, fetus simulator, as far as the musculoskeletal system is concerned, I think it's very similar to the OpenSim, and OpenSim is much more accurate, I guess. But we put particular efforts we're focusing very much on human fetuses. So it's a very specialized model with, shape or structure, all these focused on human fetuses, as well as the sensory organs, the tactile and proprioceptive and things like that, designed. Plus, of course, we have integration with the nervous system and brain model. One very particular thing is that we do have a uterus model So uterus and the amniotic fluid. So it's floating in the liquid. So that's a very special part. Yeah. But our focus is rather on integration of all these. And of course, there are lots of loose ends at the very details. So I guess OpenSim is much more sophisticated in terms of when you want to really compare with the medical data and validation and things like that. We are a little more, yeah.
Okay, so let's take 5 more minutes, and then I think people will be wanting to do other things, but still so exciting. So let's take 5 more minutes for maybe 2 or 3 last questions. So I don't know if Cecilia or Laura, you want to have some more comments or input?
I have a general comment. I would like to go back to the embodiment that was mentioned several times today. It's of course, it's a very important part of the story. And as you know, some of us in robotics also move towards exploring our other ways of building robots using the soft materials, exploiting compliance more than what was done so far. So how much do you think this is important? I think you all think it is important, but I mean, to what extent can it change a bit the way we can study also the neuromotor control? And maybe more specifically for Yasuo, because of course you went exactly to the point of co-development of brain and body. And I think that the way we can build robots with different materials, like in soft robotics, we can even dream of having robot bodies that can develop and really grow by other materials. So how much do you think that would help?
Well, that's our dream,
It's a dream.
That's a dream for many roboticists, a growing body. So it's been a long time point of discussion whether, continuous growth of body, is it different from having just a fixed body, in terms of neural development? That's a sort of a big, interesting question. But we don't know yet. Of course, in simulation, we could do to some extent, we can tweak the parameter continuously and repeat the simulation development, over time. But we don't really see, a long-term growth, and development yet. So still, it's a mystery. Another thing, back to the local issue, like soft tissue. Actually, it's a big problem for us as well. To tell the truth, to be honest, our fetus model, the surface of the model is still rigid. So it's a hard model, but it's not so much a problem as long as you are simulating it within the womb, because the surrounding tissue is also soft, simulated as a spring damper. Reaction force. But when it comes to simulating contact with other objects or the other body, it becomes a serious problem. And then because tactile sensation is extremely essential, so simulating a soft tissue becomes really a big point. We have tried several times doing that. We had lots of problems in integrating soft tissue with hard bones and all this, we're still trying. And we are interested in trying to simulate, for example, twin babies in interactions and things like that. So soft bodies, either in simulation or in reality, is a very important issue for us, particularly when it comes to learning, sensory motor learning through embodiment.
Okay, thanks a lot. So maybe one final question or comment, Laura. I'll give you the mic. Yeah.
Great. I was very surprised by the differences that you found in the fetal model, Yasuo. between the babies that were inside of the bomb and the ones that were in the outside. So the only variable that was different between these two situations was the viscosity of that was surrounding the baby.
Well, viscosity and the structure. The outside baby was put on the flat plate, so it's a hard board, versus the in utero one is floating in the liquid.
So it could be that because you were restricting some movements because there was this hard boundary, you was restricting the probability of moving?
Yeah, partially because of this, the entire bodily movement changes because of the interaction with the CPG, muscle and body and the environment, right? So the motor pattern is different. Also, sensory signal is very different. In utero, the baby moves through the liquid, so you get a continuous pressure on tactile that is actually correlates very well with the muscle activation. But in the air, you don't get that. So as it moves, you don't feel it, but you feel something. Finally, you hit some hard object. You get a spike-like signal. So the type of tactile signal is very different in these two environments.
Okay, so the question is then, if such a small difference, so I see it relatively small, has such a big effect on how we respond or how we learn, is it a good idea to replicate this brain system in our robots? Because really, I mean, you want to have a big flexibility that I understand, and this is what we have, a lot of flexibility, but it seems to me that yes, a small variation in just element is having a huge effect on all your brain mapping.
But I would say that this is good. So this brain model is capable of telling the difference, acquiring the right natural information structure that the body is giving you. So I would say in this way, this brain is really capable of dealing with a wide variety of sensory information structures. Whether it's useful or not is just depends on how you implement on a particular task. And so, of course, you can choose, I'm not saying that you should use this baby robot as is to do your housekeeping work, but this provides various options for your system to adopt for a given learning task or adaptations.
Great. So I have to stop you here. Time is up, but indeed there are many fascinating questions about development, how you can take different paths depending on the history of your interaction with the environment. So many fascinating topics. So I have to say, for me, this was a fantastic event. So I learned a lot. So thanks a lot for all the participants, especially big thanks to people in Japan. It's now, I think, almost 2 a.m. So you're really brave. Thanks a lot for people on California side who were very early up. So it's now a bit more reasonable time. I just want to have a little announcement. In 2 weeks, there will be another of these events. It will be on neuroengineering, and it will be organized by Nitish Thakur, who will give, I think, a presentation. So please tune in 2 weeks. So thanks again, everyone. Also, big thanks to the audience. I'm sorry I could not handle all your questions. There are many very good questions. Feel free to send me an email separately, or I show the speakers as well. And let's stop here. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great Christmas also, and great end of the year. Yeah, it was great participating to this. So take care, everyone.